challenging sentiment to feel as we saw what was transpiring this week in our nation's capital. I believe many of us sat stunned, shocked, thinking in our lifetimes we would not see anything like what transpired. Many of us are still processing our feelings around it. I mentioned shock, but there's anger, there's sadness, uh, there's sympathy for those who lost their lives. Um, there may be even a sense of righteous indignation. Whatever it is, I invite you to continue to give yourself some space and grace to continue to process what's coming up, because that event was triggering for all of us. And it may have brought up feelings of fear about what's happening to us, and what comes next. And I'd be remiss not to um, mention, there's still a lot of questions of how did we get here. It's not a mystery how we got here. And if you really still are wondering how we got here, I will invite you to participate in a class I'm starting in a few weeks. It's a book review, and the book is called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent, because it speaks to the issue of injustices and inequality and, yes, racism that lies honestly at the root of the dark history of this nation and still plays a part today. That book really offers the answers to how we got here. And why it's important we truly know how we got here is because if we know how we get here, we have some hope of turning, bending that arc, that moral arc, to bring us a little closer to justice, because it's on each and every one of us. There's no one politician to blame for what happened, even though we want to point at one person in particular. But I always remind people, he capitalized on a sentiment that was already there. He didn't create it. And we also want to try to put the responsibility of healing this fracture on one politician or handful of people. And the truth is, it's our collective responsibility. I thought I was going to give a whole other talk this morning, but as I revisited my notes for what I had already prepared, I realized that what I had prepared is the perfect talk to jump into today, because today we're going to start the series on this book by Buddhist teacher Tara Brach called Radical Acceptance: Embracing Your Life with the Heart of a Buddha. Because if there's anything that I think we realized over the last few years, especially poignantly, but stretching further back, is that one of the roots of our individual discontent that leads us to make some really hurtful, harmful choices towards others is our own unworthiness. When we don't have a clear, grounded, healthy sense of self, it is very easy for us to place it on the shoulders and the words and the actions of another, of one who can make promises to give us what we are afraid we have lost or are going to lose. So part of the healing is for us as individuals to heal ourselves of that. And let's be clear, we all, on some level, still struggle with that sense of unworthiness, that sense of not being good enough. There's more we should be or do. And make no mistake, we as spiritual people, we feel it too, right? Because we sometimes say to ourselves, well, I'm not enlightened enough. Or even if we take it to the other extreme and arrogantly state we are too enlightened for whatever, or I've outgrown this thing, that at its root is also coming from a sense of unworthiness. Pride and shame are sort of the opposite sides of the same coin. And that sense of unworthiness feels even more intense when we're disconnected from others and we don't feel like we belong. If we're lacking, or if I'm deficient, why would anybody want me? So when we have the opportunity to belong to something, no matter what it is, unless again we have that clear sense of self, we can just get swept up in the mob. This sense of not enoughness feels also more intense when we think our lives are out of control and there's a lot of suffering and pain and chaos. And until we make peace with the fact that our own self-worth, our sense of self, our sense of worthiness has nothing to do with being in control, because ultimately none of us are in control of anything. We can barely handle ourselves. But when we really understand that it's not about control, it's about surrender, that makes all the difference in the world. And we try to manage this sense of unworthiness by some of us, we get engaged in back-to-back self-improvement projects and spiritual practices. We try to hold ourselves back rather than take risk. We withdraw from the experience of the present moment. We keep ourselves busy. We become overly self-critical. We focus on other people's faults and point fingers and blame others. And again, we do everything to try to avoid the pain of our own discomfort with ourselves. Let me say that again. We do everything we can to avoid the discomfort of the pain with ourselves. We say to ourselves, how could someone love us because I don't even love myself? In the book, Tara Brach calls it the trance of unworthiness. We are caught up in the trance of unworthiness. We're in a trance and we don't see the truth. And the truth is that each and every one of us is worthy simply because we exist. We don't got to do nothing to prove it. It is our state of being. But we get caught up in this trance. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the trance of unworthiness and how to remove that veil and see the truth for ourselves. And by the way, on Wednesday nights, starting this week at 7 p.m., we're going to be doing a deeper dive into the book. Give you a few days to watch the book, watch the talk, read the chapters. And for the most part, every talk will be 2 chapters at a time. So if you can get chapters 1 and 2 read or reread by Wednesday, that'll be great. Send the talk to somebody, have them watch them, join our discussion. But if you haven't read, even if you haven't listened to the talk and you're catching up on this later, it's all right. Still join us, because we're gonna jump into some discussions, and we're also gonna do some meditation practices specifically towards getting ourselves out of this trance. So how did we get in this trance in the first place? The Buddha writes that all suffering or dissatisfaction arises from a mistaken understanding that we are a separate and distinct self. A separate and distinct self. And when we say self, I'm talking about the collection of thoughts, emotions, beliefs, patterns of behaviors that make us individual, right? I'm Ogun. I got a certain sense of swirl of thoughts running through here, a dark sense of humor that really isn't acquired taste, and some interest in patterns and reactions that, you know, some people like, some people not a fan of. That's my personality, right? That sits on top what we uniquely call our individuality, which is that the oneness of God expressed fully at the point of who I am. So our trance, we get into this trance of unworthiness when we believe that the personality, the self, or some of us call it the small s self, is separate, distinct, and our only reality, apart from the big S self, the divine self. And when we make our small s self a personality, the core of identity, we lose sight of the fullness of our being, of our wholeness, of our divinity. And even those of us who are aware of the truth of who we are, we swing back and forth. I can tell you that when I saw what was happening Wednesday, my first reaction was shock and disbelief. As a Enneagram 9, if those of you are familiar with Enneagram out there, is an Enneagram 9 who doesn't like to see conflict or engage in conflict. There's a part of me that didn't even want to watch it and became numb. And then the next day, the anger set in. The anger set in for a whole lot of reasons. I won't go into them now. It's not fruitful. But I'm still processing those feelings myself. That's the personality self. So sometimes we swing back and forth. And again, this is not calling the personality bad, because it's an essential part of how we survive in the world. But we've got to be mindful of when we get into the place of those emotions being triggered, and our past wounds and hurts being triggered, that we stop, we take a breath. We do not allow them to be what guides us in our next course of action. And remember that that's not the whole of who we are. We begin to awaken from this trance through radical acceptance. And that begins with accepting absolutely everything about ourselves and our lives. And make no mistake, this is entirely an inner process. It's about accepting when things happen, how we are feeling, what's been triggered, what we believe about what's going on. Taking a look and accepting, this is what's happening in me now. Noticing when we are in emotional pain, when we feel like a victim, when there's anxieties we can't shake, when there's a sense of there's something wrong with us and something wrong with the world, like just noticing them and accept that that's what we feel. And over the weeks, we'll talk about what we do about that. We touched on this months ago when I did the series on Pema Chodron's When Things Fall Apart. This is part of the process. Things fall apart, come together, fall apart, come together. Our journey is to notice where we are and how we feel when we are in that cycle. Radical acceptance, accepting what's going on within us and not making it wrong or seeking to run away from it or seek to deny it. Radical acceptance is not resignation. Accepting ourselves as we are doesn't mean we don't get to grow. It doesn't mean we don't do the work of transforming who we are. In fact, the psychologist Carl Rogers says the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. When I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. For so many years, for some of us, our entire lifetime, we felt out of place. We don't belong. We see others looking like they're having a better life than we are. Thank you, Instagram. And we think there's something wrong with us. When we accept ourselves as we are, then we can change. Radical acceptance is not defining ourselves by our limitations. So we accept ourselves as we are and we think, okay, well, this is the end of the story. It's not about that either. It's about giving clear and kind attention to the limitations without giving them the power to define who we are. It's not about self-indulgence and acting on cravings, but rather noticing the cravings that we have. And when we seek to soothe and numb ourselves with food or alcohol or TV or whatever else there is out there, noticing those cravings and noticing the need that we are seeking to appease by those things. Because when we notice the things we're trying to appease, that's where the healing occurs. Those are the wounds that we get to address with love and grace. Radical acceptance is not about being passive. Quite the contrary. We can step into action from a much more consciously centered place. The root of the word radical comes from Latin radix, which means going to the root or the origin. What are the roots and the origins of our individual pain, of our individual discontents, of our unworthiness? And until we make that conscious choice to investigate, to accept that that's where we are in our journey, regardless of where we think we are, can we objectively look within and see where we really are? Accept that without shame or judgment, and then do what it takes to be in the transformative work. It's a tall task, but a task that we are 100% equipped for. Because when we can accept ourselves as where we are, and then begin the work of transformation, continue the work of transformation intentionally and consciously, then we will be guided into right action. And I should say righteous action. Righteous meaning from the divine of who we are. But it begins with acceptance. So I invite you, if you haven't yet, grab a copy of the book, start reading. Join me also on Wednesday nights. Let's get into a deeper discussion about this, because the truth is, many of the folks that we saw on Wednesday storming the Capitol, showing up at rallies, some of them are our friends, or neighbors, or co-workers, or family members. They're hurting too. They're in a deep sense of pain. And I think some of that pain is misguided, because there's a sense of the world is changing and they are losing their sense of self. And you may not like to hear this, but I'm going to say it out loud. A lot of that does have to do with the systemic racial inequalities that has existed in this country. There's an estimation that by 2045, give or take a few years, whites in this country will become a racial minority. And I think there's a lot of fear around that for some folk. There's a lot of fear because the world as they know it will be irrevocably changed. And I believe it'll be changed for the good. Because when we are all lifted up, it benefits everyone, even them. But it's hard to see that when it feels like something is being taken away. And it feels that way when we don't have. that sense of acceptance of who we are. And we have laid claim to the worthiness that we are. When we are grounded in that, we don't need to look outside of ourselves. So please join me on Wednesday evenings and let's do the challenging work of looking at our deepest wounds, the wounds that hold us back from the fullness of who we are. And let's start to heal them. If not us, who? If not now, when?